As always, quick reminder of potential spoiler warnings for all Total Drama and Disventure Camp seasons, and all previous installments in this series are linked in the description. Though because this video is going to have a new cast, they aren't as tightly connected to this season as they are to each other, but because of certain cameos and other stuff, I'd still say it's worth watching those first if you haven't seen them yet. Anyway, let's begin. We kick off the season with the previous cast on the yacht before the big plot twist that they're being replaced with an all-new cast. We then get introduced to the boat of new players, with each of them doing something as they are introduced. Gabby would talk about how strongly she feels about the environment, and Millie would respond by nodding and writing stuff down in her journal, just saying, "That's interesting." Then Max interrupts by talking about his diabolically evil scheme, which Millie also takes note of and finds even more fascinating. Zoe and DJ would be introduced together and talk about how excited they both are to be here, until rudely interrupted by Heather, who tells them to enjoy their time while it lasts since that attitude isn't what wins you the game. Crystal then interjects and sarcastically mocks her, asking what she knows about how the game is played, and how no one could possibly be more experienced than her. This causes Crystal and Heather to fight, then panning over to Tom, who talks to someone on a walkie-talkie, before being interrupted by Aiden, who asks what he's doing. And Tom puts the walkie-talkie away and denies doing anything. Then we cut to Sky, who looks a bit distressed and says, "Oh boy, this doesn't look so fun so far." And then Duncan right next to her says, "Oh come on sweetheart, the fun is just getting started," as he starts graffitiing the boat, which makes Sky frown in more uncertainty. Finally, we cut to Cameron, who expresses joy at seeing the outside world for the first time, before falling like in the original. And right beside Cameron after he falls is Alec, who pays no attention to anything going on around him and just sighs while reading his book. Chris blows up the boat and makes all the new contestants swim to the dock, where we see Tom rescue Cameron and Aiden from drowning, Zoe holding DJ and helping him calm down to get to shore, and Duncan swims past all of them, calling them all dweebs, right before Sky is seen flipping right over him with a perfect landing on the shore. Now, originally, Chris picks the teams based on who got to shore first, but the way he did it, it didn't actually alternate the way he intended to, so since the canon doesn't really hold itself to that rule, I'm not going to use it either. Instead, I just use the random number generator to assemble the teams, with the toxic rats having 7 and the mutant maggots having 6, and this is what I got. Crystal mentions in confessional how her dad always makes things difficult for her and she always has to live up to his ridiculously high expectations to be in the hosting business one day, and that being his daughter is the worst. Also, no one else knows that she's Chris's daughter yet. Zoe is sitting on the same rock as in the original, with DJ and Millie sitting beside her, with Zoe still expressing how excited she is to be here, but DJ saying he's a little nervous. DJ has a confessional saying Zoe seems like the perfect girl to bring home to his mom, but is nervous to ask her out. Max then interrupts them by going on a spiel about becoming an evil overlord after winning the season, which everyone just kinda looks at him awkwardly for. And Millie would also be getting along with Zoe and DJ. Aiden and Tom would start talking, with Aiden inquiring about the mask, and Tom dodges the question once again. When it's revealed that they will be on separate teams, Aiden is moderately disappointed. Chris then explains how the island became a toxic wasteland, as well as the first challenge. Gabby has a confessional horrified at how horrible the treatment of the forest has been, and says if she wins the money, she plans to reverse the damage done to the environment. Tom is secretly there to investigate Chris's environmental waste dumping, and is competing mainly as a front. But he still competes in challenges and acts as a competitor and everything, so he would try climbing the tree to cut down the totem, and I think he'd get close, but in the original, even Lightning was having trouble climbing it because it was slippery. So despite Tom's training, I don't think he could quite manage to pull it off. Luckily, the rats also have Sky, and I think with a boost from Tom lifting her up, plus Duncan giving her his knife to cut the wire, they should be able to get it down before the other team, despite Max just screaming at the totem to fall as its great evil master, which, of course, does nothing. On the maggots, Gabby would prevent Crystal from cutting the tree down, and Heather would have a confessional saying she's on a team of psychos, and that frankly she was insulted no one asked her for help, since obviously she deserves to be team leader. Cameron would still get the idea to calculate someone's weight bouncing off the trampoline to get the totem down, and would suggest Alec do it since he's the heaviest person on their team, but not before Gabby tries to do it and flies headfirst into the totem, still getting the mutant cat to cut it down in the process. So both teams would be riding their totems down the waterfall with the rats in the lead. Now, originally, B is here to tell his team to lean forward so they get a softer landing and also get there first. But now that he's not here to do that, I think the rats just fly right into the fancy hotel, especially because weight distribution-wise, they're probably heavier than they are in the original. And this time they get there first. But before the other team discovers this, Alec decides to pick up a nearby stick and use it to create a current in the water that pushes them forward and knocks the other totem out of the hotel once they get there. And when Heather asks what he's doing, Cameron explains it before Alec can answer in overly analytical detail. Now I know this is kind of bullshit, but Chris originally said the maggots won even though they got there last simply because their totem tagged the cabin by impaling it and making it explode. So now I think Chris would use similar logic to declare the maggots the winners. Also, the Owen cameo still happens exactly the same as before. After the challenge, Aiden tries to talk to Tom, but Tom gets a call on his walkie-talkie and leaves before they can start a conversation. Aiden admits in confessional he should probably leave it alone, but his curiosity is forcing him to pursue Tom further, since most of his team is full of lunatics, and then says, "Don't tell them I said that though," immediately after. Heather has a confessional admitting she's impressed with Alec's quick thinking, and notes he's the only other non-imbecile on her team. Now onto the elimination, and I think it's pretty obviously Max, simply because he's the most annoying and by far the most useless challenge-wise. Maybe Tom and Duncan vote for each other just because their personalities would probably clash, with both innately just not trusting the other. And I think Max actually votes Zoe since he'd view her kindness as weakness and not evil enough. But even then, the other four still vote for him for no other reason than it just being the most obvious choice. So Max angrily rants about how his team will all rue the day they met him as Chef drags him into the catapult. On the Toxic Rats, Sky, Millie, and Zoe are all friendly to each other in the girl side of the cabin. Millie starts writing a bunch of stuff down, but because unlike in the reboot she's surrounded by more agreeable people, they're mostly benign and positive things. On the guy's side, Duncan would ask what's got DJ all twisted up in a bunch, and he admits it's a girl. Duncan in confessional would say DJ is adorable, lame, but adorable, but hey, with all that muscle, at least he's not useless. Then they have a whole "Where's Perry" moment as they realize Tom is gone. And then it cuts to Tom taking various pictures outside in the woods. Meanwhile, on the Mutant Maggots, all three girls would be arguing about who should be the team leader / who's the best player, with no one making any headway, and nothing much is really happening with the guys. Cameron doesn't have Mike to observe, and Alec and Aiden would just be minding their own business. So then the challenge starts with the first part being the embarrassing question brigade. Cameron still accidentally admits a bunch of embarrassing stuff, but this time Chris automatically gives his team a point because he thought it was hilarious. As for the actual questions, originally, the game got interrupted midway through because of Fang and a big argument stemming from a few people trying to quit. But now I don't see that happening since everyone would be much more focused in this timeline, so everyone would have to answer one. So on the Mutant Maggots, Cameron gets a free point. Heather's would be to reveal her deep social anxiety and insecurities, the kind of stuff she talks about in the Island special and World Tour. You know, how she secretly resents being hated even though she acts like she doesn't care. And she would fail this since she wouldn't want to be vulnerable. Crystal's would probably be something embarrassing from her childhood, which she would fail, because her pride wouldn't let her do otherwise. Gabby would be about hearing the voices in her head. Obviously, she's not going to admit that. Alex would be a niche fact about his messy divorce, which he would reluctantly succeed. And Aiden's would be who has a crush on someone on the other team, which he fails because even if he was brave enough to admit this, he wouldn't want to look like a traitor to his team. So they get 2 points total. Meanwhile, on the Toxic Rats, Millie's would be having her diary exposed. She would fail. Zoe's would be admitting to being a lonely child. She would clear and Millie would bond with her over this since she can also kind of relate. Tom's would be to reveal his secret identity. Obviously, he fails because he's not willing to do it. Duncan would be to admit he's afraid of the Celine Dion store standee made out of cardboard, which he fails because he doesn't really have a connection to his team, so he wouldn't get the encouragement needed to push the button. Though he would admit it in confessional, and then gets angry at the thought of being looked at funny for it. Sky's would be the belching thing that she has, which she would clear, and DJ would be that he cries over his love for his mom, like weekly, if not more, which he not only clears, but starts crying as he admits this. So with 3 points to 2, the Toxic Rats win the advantage for the next part of the challenge, which is the blurry glasses obstacle course. But the big change here is that since there's no longer a tie, only the maggots have to wear the glasses. And this makes it basically impossible for them to have any chance of winning. Even if you give Cameron plot armor like in the original this challenge, having one team basically completely blind, especially when the other team have people like Duncan, Sky, and Tom, I have to give the win to the Rats here. After the challenge, Heather starts to scheme by doing a couple things. The first is to make an alliance with Alex, seeing as he seems like the best ally to have on her team. And the second is, in order to convince him to join forces with her, she whispers a plan she has in her ear to mess with the other team in the future in order to ensure they win the next challenge. So when the team go to vote, Alec and Heather would be voting together, while everyone else would just vote by themselves. And because of that, I think the two main targets would be Gabby and Crystal. Both of them are very aggressive and hindrances and challenges, Gabby for her love of nature and general craziness getting in others' way, and Crystal for just being very standoffish and acting like she's too good for everyone else. But the thing is, at least with Gabby, her love of the environment can sort of be seen as endearing, if a bit excessive. Meanwhile, Crystal's pompous attitude has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. So Aiden and Cameron, plus probably Gabby, all vote for Crystal, and Heather and Alec would probably also vote Crystal since they'd kinda read the room and figure it's the best decision to make. And with Crystal's 1 vote against Heather and 5 against her, she's voted out. Crystal then reveals she's not going anywhere because she's protected by nepotism. And once it's confirmed, Heather and Gabby both rage against how unfair that is. But Chris quickly cuts them off and reveals Crystal will still be on the island, but now only as an intern and no longer a competitor. And Crystal screams in frustration as Chef carries her off screen. Zoe and DJ bump into each other outside and start lightly flirting with each other before both of them awkwardly stumble away. Aiden and Tom also bump into each other, and Aiden actually manages to get him to stay and hang out with him this time. But Tom still won't take off the mask. When the challenge starts and they all have to climb the mountain, Sky immediately gets ahead of everyone else, only for Chef to throw an ice cube at her head, making her fall all the way down, which shocks her whole team. Duncan takes note of this and manages to dodge Chef's ice cubes, taunting him while doing so. Meanwhile, DJ calms the angry beetle at the bottom by bringing its pet, since DJ is good with animals. And Zoe in confessional would say it's super sweet how good he is with animals. Even though Chef eventually hits Duncan with an ice cube, Duncan's taunting would get the focus off the rest of his team, who would now be able to get there much faster. And Duncan could definitely make it back up there before all 5 of the people on Team Maggot. So the rats win the first part of the challenge and obviously pick the ice fortress since Scott isn't here to sabotage them, leaving the maggots with the inferior ice shack. The objective of this part of the challenge is capture the flag and or destroy the other's fortress. And even though the rats have the advantage, this is when Heather enacts her plan to pull the other team apart from the inside out. Heather shows the other team Millie's notebook after stealing it and over-exaggerating a bunch of things in a mean and pretentious way, making her entire team turn on her. She would think of this idea from last episode when the question came up for the diary being exposed, since even though Millie didn't answer, Heather could figure it out by default or just find her name on the diary when she's searching for it. Alec in confessional says he knows Heather's plan is callous, but ultimately necessary for his team. And even though the rats are much more athletic, the Millie diary issue now gives Cameron enough time to come up with a strategy to win. Basically just doing the same thing B did originally, using a giant mirror to reflect the sunlight onto the ice fortress, with Alec and Heather doing most of the heavy lifting to actually make Cameron's plan work since he's a weakling. Even still, I think it'd be pretty close, but Gabby comes in clutch at the last second to bulldoze the other team when Heather lies to her that the rats kidnapped an animal, allowing her to capture their flag and give her team the win. Heather has a confessional proud of herself and says being a good team leader is all about knowing what makes sheeple tick while looking at her nails. Rats go to vote despite Millie's insistence she was framed. Zoe and Sky, and by extension the rest of her team, are too hurt to vote for anyone else, so Millie is voted out 5-1. Zoe and DJ continue bonding and have a picnic outside, where we see Heather spying on them in the bushes. In confessional, Heather says she doesn't like how well Zoe and DJ are getting along because dating means alliance, and she can't allow any other alliances to exist. But shortly after, Alec catches her, and even though Heather tries to deny it, Alec tells her he knows what she's doing, and tells her not to poke the bear too much so that a target isn't put on her back. On the toxic rats, Duncan starts spying on Tom, because he says in confessional he doesn't trust the guy, and seeing him with the walkie-talkie being reminiscent of a government agent, even though Duncan doesn't know he's a spy, would give him extra reason to distrust him. Everyone is still woken up in the middle of the night to do the challenge, and the Izzy spider cameo still happens with her webbing up everyone throughout the challenge. Each team would start off together, and with Heather as the team leader, she suggests following the other team from behind and let them deal with all the obstacles first. Sky would check out the tree and get attacked by the giant octopus eyeball creature and narrowly escape its grasp before getting taken by Izzy. Tom would still be out taking more photos and reporting to his walkie-talkie, and Duncan would still be following him and realize that Chris confiscated all electronic devices, so it's interesting how Tom still somehow has one. And then Duncan is taken by Izzy. Gabby would also get taken while her team is walking through the forest. After that, both teams find their clues and continue on, but Cameron would also get taken searching for clues, and Aiden would get lost and run into Tom afterwards. The remaining 6 still haven't been kidnapped since they've been sticking together, and Izzy usually targets people who are alone, so that leaves 3 people per team left. And since at this point Zoe hasn't really shown any aggression or athleticism yet, the only person who could evade and rescue the others from Izzy is Tom with his spy training. And so once they get to the end of the challenge, everyone besides Tom and Aiden get caught in the web. But Duncan manages to cut himself loose with his knife and deflate Izzy's spider costume, revealing it to be her. And once Izzy gives up on her hunt, Tom and Duncan both free the rest of their team, and even though the rats win with 5-1 people completing the challenge, Duncan still confronts Tom for quote-unquote saving the enemy. And Tom tells him it's no big deal since they still won, and Duncan just glares and signals that he's watching him. Aiden apologizes for Duncan's hostility, and Tom says it's fine, and tells Aiden he can't answer some of his questions, but he still wants to hang out with him, and they hug. Now, once again, Heather and Alec would control the vote since they already have 2 of the 5, and both of them can easily get Cameron to vote with them since he has no beef with them and he'd just be going off of logic. And Gabby and Aiden probably vote for each other since there's no one better to choose, meaning that Aiden gets 4 votes because they'd all now know about him cozying up to Tom and view that as a potential liability. And they would explain that to him after he's voted, and Heather would just say nothing personal. But just like in the original, Chris reveals the person voted out this episode actually switches to the other team instead. So now Aiden would join the rats. Now that Tom and Aiden are officially on the same team, they could start dating while the rest of the team besides Duncan welcomes him with open arms. Sky has a confessional saying she's glad they got rid of Millie and now have Aiden, since their team now has strength in both morale and numbers, and she believes her team can smooth sail until the merge with this current setup. Bridget still has her brief cameo with Crystal to test out the challenge, with the boat exploding and launching both of them. For the first part of the challenge, one person from each team has to go underwater and cut their skis loose, while the rest of the team pumps their air. Sky would offer to go for her team, wanting to keep up their win streak, while DJ pumps her air, and Heather tells Gabby to go underwater and Alec to pump the air. Gabby would start to get annoyed at how bossy Heather is, but wouldn't say anything just yet. And Heather would take this opportunity to go look for the immunity idol in the meantime. I know I didn't mention it before, but yeah, the immunity idol is still a thing this season, but the only people who I think would really be searching for it are Heather for strategy and Duncan and Tom, since they're already out and about all the time, and would figure they might as well. Now, between Sky and Gabby, obviously Sky is going to be much faster, but in the original it was shown Fang messed with the person who was behind, which in this case would be Gabby, accidentally launching her into her skis, making the maggots win as a result. So for the next part of the challenge, the maggots get the speedboat and the rats get the dinghy, and both come with 3 seagulls to launch to hit the buoys with. Sky doesn't let this loss bring her down, and she draws out a plan for her team to win, before they all put their hands in the middle and they say, "Go team," except Duncan, who reluctantly joins in, after Sky insists. In confessional, Duncan insists the only person worth looking out for is himself, since Mrs. Athlete and the 2 pairs of lovebirds are ultimately only in it for themselves at the end of the day. Heather calls the gun and tries to tell Gabby to ski with Cameron, but because Heather left the first part of the challenge, Gabby refuses, saying it's only fair she gets to drive this time, and before Heather can respond, Alec interjects and tells Heather to just go with it. Heather would be frustrated in confessional, saying not only is Gabby a pain in the ass, but she never even found the damn idol, and she hates how well Chris must have hit it. Duncan calls the gun for his team, and Sky insists on driving, which the other 4 are cool with, since even though she lost last time, that means they all get to ski together, which they would want to do because, you know, they're 2 couples. And plus, none of them are super aggressive or overly competitive like that anyway. Duncan could easily hit the first buoy before Heather, and when Heather gets frustrated as they're losing, Gabby shifts into maximum overdrive and speeds right into the second buoy, destroying their boat in the process. And Duncan's second seagull would miss because the buoy would already be hit before he could get to it, throwing off his aim as a result. Now Duncan only has 1 seagull left, and because Cameron is so light, Gabby's crash would launch him in the air so that when Duncan's last seagull is shot, it would accidentally hit Cameron instead of the buoy, and Cameron would still land on the last buoy since the crash from the speedboat would launch him a lot further than the dinghy. So Cameron is temporarily injured, and his team compliments him on the unintentional sacrifice that gave them the win. Aiden and Tom would have a team meeting with DJ and Zoe and insist they all vote Duncan tonight. Zoe and DJ would be kinda hesitant since DJ kinda likes Duncan and he's pretty decent at challenges, but Aiden and Tom would insist they do it since at this point it's either him or them, since obviously they're sticking together and Sky's their team leader, forcing Zoe and DJ to agree. So come the vote, DJ, Zoe, Aiden, and Tom all vote for Duncan, with Sky also probably voting for Duncan too since he's not really a team player. But Duncan would say, "Sorry losers, I ain't leaving just yet," as he reveals he has the immunity idol, shocking everybody and greatly upsetting Tom and Aiden since they both really wanted him gone. The reason I think Duncan finds the idol is because he and Tom would cover the most ground and are also 2 of the most likely to have the skills to find it. But the difference is, unlike Tom, Duncan wouldn't be preoccupied with his spy job, so he'd have more time to find it. This means that Duncan gets sole vote, and he's pretty obviously voting Tom out, since he's a threat to him and he doesn't trust him. Aiden and Tom have one last kiss goodbye, and Tom would return to the island in secret by authority of his agency investigating Chris, but he'd now have to keep his presence secret from everybody so he doesn't get caught. no longer being in the competition. Aiden would be super angry at Duncan, to which Duncan responds with apathy, since he insists Tom isn't who he seems, and plus they all would have voted him out last night anyway, so why should he feel bad? Sky says yesterday was a mess since they not only lost, but morale is now in the toilet, and she really needs to pull through for her team today. The first part of this challenge is to dress up a mutant animal in the forest, and Zoe and Heather would both do makeup for each. But regardless of who Chris and the judges decide is better, it doesn't matter because the maggots would still get desperate and pick the gorilla, which Cameron would lure out, and the gorilla still gets mad and kidnaps Lindsay, who still makes a cameo here. The monkey still uses a jetpack and brings her to the top of Boney Island. Chris also still sends both teams to rescue Lindsay as the new challenge, forcing all of them to play real-life Donkey Kong like in the original. Now, I don't really think anyone here is a gamer, so no one would try doing what Sam did, but Duncan could come up with a prison-type strategy, kinda like in Dodge Brawl, with his team climbing up every side of the mountain. This doesn't work, and up to this point the mutant maggots are sitting ducks until Cameron comes up with the idea to use Heather as bait by dyeing her hair blonde and trying to get her to attract the monkey. And I think this would work since, it's a monkey who goes unga bunga kidnap pretty woman, causing it to jump down from the mountain and try to kidnap Heather instead of Lindsay, while Alec climbs up to rescue her. But Sky manages to get ahead of Alec and saves Lindsay first. Even though Heather would complain that her team should win for distracting the monkey, Chris would insist the rats win, because Lindsay was still stranded on top of a mountain before Sky saved her. And during the vote, even though Cameron is now starting to get a bad vibe from Heather, he wouldn't want to risk causing a tie between her and Gabby since that would put a target on his back, and finds it easier to just vote Gabby along with the other two instead, so she loses 3-1. Especially because her paranoia around the environmental hazards makes her a liability. This is also the episode where Chris asks a strong competitor from each team to volunteer for something, which in this case I think would be Duncan and Heather, and so now they switch teams. Also, at the end of the episode, we would get this sort of shadow Easter egg that would imply that Tom has now returned to the island in secret. Now, this episode is interesting because Ezekiel is no longer in the mine, meaning the mutant gophers never try to kidnap anyone for him. So while it would still be very dangerous with everyone entering a toxic mine, it'd be much easier to navigate this time. The Rats' carts still get separated with Sky, DJ, and Zoe in one group and Heather and Aiden in another. Zoe and DJ alone, they confess their fears and love for each other and now officially start dating. Even though Heather wouldn't see this happen, she'd know that it would be coming sooner or later, so she'd be manipulating Aiden into voting for DJ. And to sweeten the deal, promises to help him boot off Duncan the next chance they get in exchange for this vote. And obviously, since this is a sweet deal for Aiden and he doesn't have a reason not to trust Heather, plus, even if he did, he's been shown to not be the brightest in that regard anyway, he'd shake on it with her while Heather hides her fingers crossed behind her back. I think with the combined skills and intelligence of Cameron, Duncan, and Alec, they should be able to win this challenge, since they're not dispersed like the other team, and they're just in better shape to find the golden Chris statue and escape. So with no Ezekiel or mutant gophers in the way, they should win pretty easily. Everyone eventually makes it out of the cave, and Alec checks in with Heather to make sure she's safe for the coming vote on her team. And to ensure her safety, Heather tells Alec to convince Sky to vote off DJ with the reasoning of DJ and Zoe being too close and lovey-dovey, and with how against dating Sky was in the original season of Pocketoo Island, this would be a good enough reason for her to join Heather and Aiden in voting off DJ. So he gets 3 votes to Heather's 2. DJ and Zoe would be shocked, and when they discover how DJ got booted, Zoe now develops a vendetta against Heather, and now starts to move away from being overly shy and nice. Everyone still gets knocked out cold by eating mutant turkey the previous night and wakes up on rafts above water. Zoe and Heather would be beefing with each other while Sky desperately tries to get them to get along. Cameron still gets the giant squid to launch his team to win the first part of the challenge, giving them a compass and a map to rescue Tess, who takes Gwen's place buried alive for the cameo this episode. Crystal doesn't get mutated because Chris wouldn't want his own daughter to go through that despite his harsh treatment of her, so he would never have sent her in the mine last episode. And I know I haven't talked much about her internship, but that's because there really isn't that much to it, at least not yet. I don't really think she'd grow as a person because she's still living under Chris's shadow, something she's shown to be very insecure about in Disventure Camp. But she will become relevant later on, trust me. So anyway, because the rats lost, they all have to wear metal detectors despite looking for a wooden chest, and this is important because originally only 2 people had to wear them, both of whom are pretty strong, them being Joe and Lightning, whereas now 4 people have to wear them, most of whom are going to have a harder time doing so. Aiden's metal detector would draw him towards Tom's communication device, but since Tom has to keep his presence a total secret, he'd run away before Aiden could talk to him. This of course confuses and frustrates Aiden, causing him to search for Tom on his own. And also, Scott isn't here to give the other team directions, so the rats might not even know where to go. On the mutant maggots, Alec offers to make an alliance with Cameron so they can vote Duncan out if they lose, and also because without Heather on his team, Alec would want another ally. In confessional, Alec would say Cameron is the perfect person to team up with, since he's pretty much the only one here who can match or even exceed his intellect, while also being a great person to fight in the finale for being so physically weak. And since Mike isn't here and Zoe and Cameron aren't nearly as close in this timeline, he would accept since he doesn't really have many better options. Cameron would then ask Alec about Heather and say, "What about her? I thought you were in an alliance with her," and he'd say he still wants to team up with her, but doesn't think she'll survive the next vote, so he wants to keep his options open. Even though the map leads the maggots directly to a thorn bush, giving the rats a chance to catch up, Duncan could use a lighter he snuck in, or just gather some sticks to light a fire to forge a path through the thorn bushes. Plus, Cameron originally found the way there, even without the compass or map, by tracking moss on trees, so he could still do that here too. On top of all of that, everyone on the maggots is pretty smart, so they should be able to find Tess underground pretty quickly. So for all of those reasons, mutant maggots win the challenge, sending the rats to elimination. Now, this vote was the first one that was genuinely pretty difficult to determine. And even though Zoe and Heather would want to vote for each other, I think Skye would convince both of them to vote Aiden off with her, because he's clearly in his own world. And even though they refused to do so at first, Skye reminds them that if they do the math, she could almost guarantee her vote would send one of them home, given the numbers if they don't comply with her demands. So both give in and all three of them vote Aiden out, but because Chris would be bored and want to do a double elimination, he'd force Crystal to take the catapult with him. And now we are at the merge. Pretty interesting cast, and hey, 1/3 of them are the same, so how about that? After Chris announces the merge, Alec wouldn't really have a way of hiding the fact that he wants to team up with both Heather and Cameron, so what he does is he tells Heather they should bring Cameron with them to the final three, so they can easily reserve both their spots in the finale when the time comes, and get the stronger players out first using his vote, which Heather agrees to, but of course she would also want to have a plan B, especially with an angry Zoe breathing down her neck. So she goes to Duncan for an alliance. And at first, Duncan is openly hostile towards Heather, but once she points out that he doesn't trust anyone anyway, but it's in his best interest to help her out because everyone else is probably gunning for him, he ultimately agrees with her point and decides to team up with her, but would intentionally keep this a secret. I considered if Skye and Zoe would team up, but Zoe is way too bloodlusted at this point for that to work, even though she's not commando. And Skye wouldn't want to take any chances, because, you know, she's all about, like, fair play and stuff like that. Now, because Duncan is competing this time, someone else needs to take his place as the cameo, and I decided it would be Caleb since there needs to be a reason to force someone to come back, and the only thing I can think of is that Caleb spent too much of the money that he willingly sacrificed in the island special, and in order to pay off his debt, Chris made him demonstrate the challenge in exchange for calling it even. So obviously, Caleb isn't going to run away and plant a bomb in Mount Chrismore, but he'd just kind of be there. And Chris still announces that whoever wins this challenge gets the sole vote in determining who gets eliminated. So everyone should be able to grab a go-kart key in the kitchen. There's some mutant critters and other obstacles, but nothing serious enough to really hold anyone back. So everyone has to get past Chef to get to the carts at the same time. Now, of the 6 carts, 2 of them are super slow, one of them being the golden one. And the random number generator decided that Skye would get the golden key, and Heather gets the other bad key. And in confessional, Skye would probably be confused and frustrated that the gold key led her astray because, you know, like Olympic gold and stuff. But when he sees Heather lagging behind, Alec begrudgingly agrees to help her, wanting to retain her trust since Chris still says they can't trade back keys. So Alec lets her hop on his cart even though it slows them down. And Chef originally manages to catch 2 people and lock them up, and since in the original those 2 were Joe and Lightning, who are both very athletic, I see no reason why he wouldn't be able to do the same thing here. So I used the random number generator, which decided that Cameron and Duncan get locked up. But because Duncan is an ex-juvenile, he'd find a way to escape pretty easily, and he and Cameron both managed to find working carts. So with Duncan and Cameron losing time in the cell, and Heather and Alec weighing down their cart, and Skye also having a bad cart, this leaves Zoe ahead of everyone else. Because he knows he's probably going to lose anyway, Alec lets Heather take the wheel and leaves to go check on Cameron, unbeknownst to her, and just tells Heather he trusts her to win it for them and keep him safe. Heather says in confessional that's a dumb thing for Alec to believe, but in this case it's a smart move since she's obviously going to boot Zoe if she wins. So Alec runs into Cameron on his go-kart and explains he let Heather take the lead without him since he wants to lay low for now, while Duncan still drives to Mount Chrismore to put an explosive in it as revenge for getting locked up, since that was still technically Chris's idea even though Chef did it. As Chef would still add that as a 4th fake landmark to get back at Chris for making the campers take his stuff. Now originally Zoe does really well in this challenge, and only loses because Scott threw her off at the last minute before tagging the third totem. But now, without Alec weighing him down, Heather should have just enough time to catch up to her to do the same thing Scott did. But this time, with Zoe's added aggression and skills, she'd stop Heather from climbing after being knocked off by kicking her spray bottle out of her hands, and Heather grabs the other and just chucks it, leaving both of them to race back to grab them in what's essentially a sudden death round to see who gets to eliminate the other, racing and crashing into each other along the way. And because of this, I think Alec and Cameron would be able to get to the third totem before Sky, since she'd want to play fair and just ride out the slow car. Or just, wouldn't know what else to do. Other than maybe run, I guess. And Cameron would willingly let Alec win immunity since he came back for him, so, he'd trust him. But everyone still goes to mount Chris Moore to tag it, but before anyone can do so, Duncan makes it explode and proudly announces doing so, and jokingly says he deserves to win immunity because his tag made the biggest impact. And then in confessional says that's what happens when you try to lock up this menace, while pointing to himself, then pointing outward and saying, "Got that?" However, as punishment, Chris makes him wear a chicken costume for the entirety of the next episode, since he wouldn't want to have him arrested for the mountain because it's not worth nearly as much as the cottage, and plus then they'd be down a player super late into the game, which would mess things up. So now with Alec deciding who to boot, there's a few options to consider. Obviously, Heather and Cameron are both safe, since Alec is teamed up with both of them, and Heather wants Zoe gone, but Alec would want to keep her in to distract Heather from turning on them. Plus, she's already pretty unstable, so he doesn't think she poses much of a threat. Meanwhile, Duncan is super untrustworthy and Sky is very much a threat. But at least with Duncan, Alec kinda knows what to expect from him, since they were on the same team and he wasn't really too much of an issue. Whereas he knows very little about Sky other than her being probably the most athletic competitor left, so he'd have the most reason to get rid of her. This shocks literally everybody since Sky seemingly did nothing to put that target on her back, and she would leave extremely bitter while Alec just insists it's nothing personal. Heather would be furious at Alec for not eliminating Zoe and considers this enough of a betrayal to consider him just as much of an enemy as Zoe. So she intentionally gets between him and Cameron and basically forces Cameron to do whatever she says, kinda like Joe did originally. Zoe and Cameron still build the plane and the rocket, while Duncan gets the bird, which further humiliates him wearing the chicken costume, Heather gets the air balloon, and Alec gets the helicopter. And since no one is smarter than Cameron, he still manages to start his ride first, and Heather would steal the smoke machine he won after. Now, Heather's cameo this episode needs to be replaced with someone else since she's already competing, and I decided to pick Julia since in this timeline she still fits the quote-unquote evil superstar status that Heather's cameo fulfilled originally. And even though Julia didn't win in World Tour, let's be real, she still bonks Chris and Chef over the head with the jemmies and steals the money in the blimp because, well, it's Julia. So the challenge still stays the same with everyone trying to stop Julia from escaping with the money. Alec would continually be asking Cameron why he's letting Heather walk all over him, which he doesn't reveal the answer to until he does the same thing he did to Joe, hiding a small explosive in the smoke machine to take Heather out of the air when she's least expecting it. Zoe would also still take control of the mutant goats and make them fire at Heather after Duncan flies her back up, taking both of them out of the challenge as a result. Alec wouldn't be reckless enough to fly his vehicle into Julia's blimp, but Cameron still does since that happened in the original, but because this time there's no fight for the briefcase happening inside the blimp, Julia would have enough time to be able to grab the $1 million and escape the blimp crash, but ultimately still get caught by a suspiciously psychotic looking redhead, as the goats surround her, leaving her no choice but to surrender the briefcase, meaning that Zoe gets immunity this time. As for the vote, I think it's pretty obviously Heather, with Alec, Cameron, and Zoe all voting for her. But before Heather goes, she lies to Zoe telling her booting DJ was actually Alec's idea as a way to throw him under the bus. And when Alec tries to dispute this, Heather points out how it's provable that he voted for him. So what good is his word really? And also pins the Millie diary thing on him as well just for good measure. This gets both Zoe and Cameron to turn on him, since even though they don't like Heather, she's out of the game now and thinks she has no reason to lie about this. Duncan would be relieved that he can finally take the chicken suit off and also likes that the heat is mostly off his back at this point, and that he's glad Heather is gone since she was really just weighing him down. I know Chris wouldn't have a reason to get caught in the snare that traps him in the outhouse, but I don't know how to rewrite the entire challenge, so I'll just say he was sick this episode and Chef would greenlight his own challenge to get revenge on the campers for touching his stuff 2 episodes ago. Alec would try to salvage his alliance with Cameron, but it wouldn't work, and Zoe would be gunning for him while Duncan immediately rejects any possibility of teaming up with him, leaving Alec to fend for himself. For the cooking challenge, the DJ cameo is replaced with Cody, who still doesn't want to be here and ultimately finds a way to escape being tied up, which still prompts Chef to force the campers to eat their own food. And Cameron still wins with his quiche since neither Duncan nor Alec have the best track records when it comes to culinary challenges, and Zoe still gets poison ivy from the salad she made. So everyone besides Cameron has to wear a tracking collar, but Alec does ultimately convince Cameron to deactivate his tracking collar in exchange for a piggyback to the finish, since even though Cameron doesn't like Alec, he's also not very good at running. Zoe still gets cornered by Chef, forcing her off a cliff and triggering Commando Zoe to fully come out. Only in this timeline, the process is much more gradual, since now she has 3.5 episodes to transition instead of just 1.5. And she still has the stealth fight shootout thing with Chef at the end. Duncan manages to navigate the woods the fastest and gets to the flagpole first, but Fang is still waiting there for his next victim, so he chases Duncan off, leaving Alec and Cameron to get to the finish line first while the other two are distracted. And before, Alec probably would have just let Cameron win, but now that it's down to the final 4 and he knows Cameron doesn't trust him anymore, Alec would throw Cameron off his back and get immunity for himself, while Zoe and Chef and Duncan and Fang are all still having a wild goose chase. Alec tries to apologize to Cameron, but he doesn't want to hear it, and this dispute can be heard by Duncan in the bushes. Duncan in confessional says he's been going it alone not just for personal preference, but also so he could sneak around and hear how to exploit the others. And he would overhear Cameron and Alec's beef, so Duncan would talk to Alec and say he changed his mind on the whole quote-unquote alliance thing, even though he doesn't mean a word of it, and really just wants to take advantage of a good opportunity. Alec obviously wants his help voting Cameron, so he accepts. So yeah, these two vote Cameron, while Zoe and Cameron probably vote Duncan by default. This means there is now a tiebreaker between Cameron and Duncan, which could go a million different ways, but I decided Duncan would win because the tiebreaker would most likely be survival based in the short term, with Chef hunting them down with the pasta launcher again. And without the untrackable advantage he had in the challenge, Cameron wouldn't get very far in something like that, especially against someone like Duncan. So Duncan and Alec would decide to 2v1 Zoe, since even though they don't trust each other, they barely recognize and are pretty terrified of Commando Zoe with how insanely strong she is. Duncan in confessional says he knew she was a little crazy before, but now she's starting to scare even him a little bit, and then realizes he kinda digs that. So each person gets a piece of the map, and Zoe ended up getting the part with the X while Duncan and Alec get the other two and just follow the map until it cuts off. This obviously gives Duncan and Alec a pretty big advantage since they would actually know where to go, but this would be balanced out by a couple things. One, Commando Zoe is insanely agile, so she'd have no problem covering twice as much ground as the other competitors. Alec and Duncan wouldn't trust each other and constantly be looking over their backs, since they obviously aren't just gonna let the other win this challenge when the stakes are this high. And 3, Tom would make another appearance, gathering even more evidence as he's now stumbled upon a goldmine of illegal evidence in the mutated forest and pictures of Larry. Alec and Duncan would hear rustling in the bushes, expecting it to be some sort of mutant when it turns out to be Tom. So Duncan angrily confronts him and forces him to spill the beans, threatening to rat him out to Chris if he doesn't tell the truth. So with no other choice, Tom whispers what he's doing to Duncan, which leads Duncan in confessional saying, "That's seriously messed up, man." And this interaction would also make Duncan and Alec lose even more time. So with all that said, all 3 campers would get to Larry at pretty much the same time, with Zoe having a slight lead. Alec asks how they're going to get the flower from Larry, and Duncan initiates his plan to use Alec as bait, and since Alec doesn't have Cameron's allergies, he would just barely manage to grab the flower out of Larry's mouth and run off with it. And Duncan in confessional would facepalm and say he probably should have seen that coming. As Alec is running with the flower, Larry chases him, very nearly catching him before he hides behind a tree and blends in with the ground. But right after saying, "Phew, that was close," Zoe sneaks up from behind him, swinging from a vine and grabs the flower from him. Where now Alec, Larry, and Duncan are all chasing Zoe as she heads for the finish line. And Zoe just barely manages to cross the finish line before Larry can get to her. After Zoe gives the flower back to Chris, Chris gives the flower back to Larry, and they rekindle in the weirdest way imaginable. And Duncan and Chef both agree how messed up what they're witnessing is. So since Zoe won, she gets to pick who gets eliminated. And since Alec knows she hates his guts, he says he had a good run and finally comes clean about wanting to win the money for his ex-wife more than anything. But after realizing he did all this just to end up losing to a giant man-eating plant and a redhead teenager half his age, he admits it probably wasn't meant to be, and walks toward the hurl of shame. However, Zoe interrupts his speech and decides actually Duncan is getting booted. And when both he and Alec ask why, Zoe says Duncan is the much bigger threat and that she'd much rather crush Alec's sad, pathetic ass in the finale and go for the easy win. Alec would ask Zoe again why she decided to keep him in, and she goes off on him saying she's gonna crush him in the finale to avenge everyone that got hurt by him, between Sky, Millie, and especially DJ. Alec would admit he certainly wasn't blameless with hurting those people, but he insists he wasn't doing it to be overly cruel like Heather and just wanted to play the game the best he could, and asks Zoe if her friends would really want her to have turned this cold. Zoe in the confessional is kinda torn on this comment, sort of second guessing her commando persona but still not giving it up just yet. Almost every other player this season is still sitting in the peanut gallery except Tom and Crystal, and nobody gets put in the trauma chair this time, and also pretty much everyone would be making fun of Heather when she says she deserved to be in the finale. The final challenge still remains the same, with the rules being whoever pins the other down for 3 seconds after choosing their weapons and armor to fight wins the season. Zoe would pretty much do the same thing as Lightning, keeping it pretty simple in caveman type armor with a striking weapon, and almost everyone would be rooting for her, so Alec just kinda sits there kicking rocks as he tries to build something that can give him a fighting chance. Everyone in the audience would notice how one-sided this fight seems. Even though they want Zoe to win, they can't help but feel a little bad for Alec. And even though Cameron won't help him build an Iron Man suit, I think Duncan's pity would get the better of him, and he would decide to help Alec put together what's essentially a block of armor. And then Duncan picks up a fire extinguisher in the rubble, handing it to Alec saying, "Here, you'll need this." Alec asks why Duncan's helping him, and Duncan tells him not to get the wrong idea. He just wants to see a real fight for the entertainment instead of just seeing Alec get slaughtered. And Alec hastily says, "Thanks, I guess." When the fight begins, Alec's armor would be tanking Zoe's strikes as he struggles to retaliate, but ultimately manages to whack her with the fire extinguisher by surprise, but Chris would still be bored and start releasing the mutant animals. Now, Zoe and Alec might be able to fend off 1 or 2 of them, but some of those animals are really, really big and just too much to handle, so I think both of them would be about to get mauled before Tom and Crystal show up. I think one of the bigger mutants would chase both Zoe and Alec off the arena, and they would both be about to get mauled right before Tom and Crystal show up with an elite squad of secret agents who would save them and tell them to shush on their presence. And both Zoe and Alec wide-eyed signal that their lips are sealed. Chris would be annoyed that the fighters don't seem to be in enough pain and also that he doesn't know where they are, so he accidentally breaks the controller by pressing it too hard and dropping it from his booth, causing it to fall apart and triggers all of the mutants to come out at once. Zoe and Alec would both glare at each other before fighting again, and right as Zoe was about to pin Alec down, she'd see all her friends being endangered by all the mutants, and she would use her commando skills to help save everyone, and even get a few personalized moments in the midst of the chaos. She'd get a wink from Skye as the two of them help save the crowd. She and Millie would reconcile and Zoe would apologize for falsely accusing her of shit-talking her, and DJ would somehow make peace with all the smaller mutant animals, so they all attack Larry along with Commando Zoe, who are all able to find his weak spot. And Zoe and DJ would hug after all the mutants are cleared, which after a few moments prompts Zoe to finally give up her commando persona, removing her war paint, putting her weapon down, and letting her hair back to what it was before. Alec then comes charging back in saying he's not done yet, tackling Zoe to the ground with the crowd looking in shock. He'd managed to pin her down for 2 seconds before Zoe kicks him off of her up into the air, so high into the air in fact, that his metallic armor gets caught on an electric wire, which electrocutes him and causes him to plummet to the ground. Zoe, along with everyone else, would be shocked at what just happened, and Zoe would say, "Oh my god, are you alright?" with Cameron reminding her to pin him for 3 seconds, which she obviously easily does now. And with that, Zoe wins Total Drama Revenge of the Island, with everyone in the crowd clapping except Heather, who just flips her hair back and says whatever. The alternate ending plays out with Alec falling directly on top of Zoe after getting electrocuted, causing her to be unable to get up, and having Alec be the one pinning her down instead. And also, pretty much no one would cheer, but Zoe would get up smiling saying she's okay and everyone would be happy for her. Chris then hands the winner in each ending the $1 million, but before Chris is able to close out the season and blow up the boat he sent the campers home on, the detonator doesn't work at all this time. When Chris yells for Chef, he notices Chef is nowhere to be seen, and we then hear a high-pitched scream coming from the island. Everyone on the boat would also hear the scream, and so DJ immediately turns the boat around so they can investigate. Once Chris and the cast members arrive at the scene, they see Tom and his men just now saving Crystal from a mutant gopher by incapacitating it with a bunch of darts. Crystal then lambasts Chris in front of everyone for being a terrible father, and reveals she became an informant and future testifier for Tom and his agency to book him on. When Chris tries to call security, nothing happens, and when he tries to flee the scene, Tom ambushes him, and he is then surrounded by a swath of agents ready to detain him, with Chris screaming as the whole thing goes down. Everyone would be slack-jawed, including the cameraman, and Tom breaks the awkward silence by giving one last outro to the season. Tom would be seen investigating Chris with a partner, and explains to him how between Chef taking a plea deal to cooperate against him, as well as Crystal testifying against him, on top of the mountains of irrefutable evidence of environmental endangerment he got, he's gonna go to jail for a long, long time, and he might as well plead guilty now. As Chris is taken to his cell, the prison guard tells him his new cell just emptied up, and it is revealed that Mal is now being let out of prison, with the final scene in the season being Mal's back turned to the camera as he chuckles to himself. So that was Revenge of the Island. I hope you enjoyed, and All Stars might take a little bit longer to set up because more logistics, but yeah, see you then.